Welcome to Whispers of the Moon, where the chilling and unexplainable come to life. Tonight, we bring you three spine-tingling tales as we ring in the new year, a time of celebration, resolutions, and hope for a brighter future. But sometimes the past refuses to let go. So grab your blankets, turn off the lights, and let the stories begin. First story.
Daniel sat alone in his dimly lit apartment on New Year's Eve, a half-empty glass of whiskey in hand and his phone in the other. He had skipped the usual parties this year, opting instead for a quiet night of scrolling through social media and watching strangers post their resolutions. Resolutions. He scoffed at the thought. Daniel had made a resolution once. Years ago, after his grandmother died, he made a promise to himself to visit his grandmother's grave every year. She had practically raised him, always reminding him of the importance of family. But as the years went by, life got busy, and the visits stopped. As the clock approached midnight, Daniel heard a faint tapping at his window. The sound was barely noticeable at first, blending with the occasional pop of fireworks in the distance. He dismissed it as the wind rattling the glass and kept scrolling. The tapping grew louder and more insistent. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Annoyed, Daniel got up, the floor creaking beneath his feet. "Daniel, what now?" he muttered as he walked to the window. Pulling back the curtain, he froze. Standing in the snow was an old woman. Her face was gaunt, her skin as pale as the frost-covered ground. Sunken, lifeless eyes stared up at him. She wore a tattered black dress that hung loosely on her frail frame. Daniel's throat went dry. The woman raised a bony hand, her fingers crooked like branches, and pointed directly at him. Her lips parted, and in a voice that rasped like dry leaves, she whispered, "You forgot me, Daniel." His heart thundered in his chest as he stumbled back, almost dropping his drink. When he looked again, she was gone. Daniel spent the rest of the night pacing his apartment, his thoughts racing. The woman's words echoed in his mind, stirring memories he had tried to bury. By morning, he could no longer ignore the knot of guilt twisting in his stomach. He drove to the cemetery, the winter sun pale and cold in the sky. The snow crunched under his boots as he approached his grandmother's grave. When he reached it, he froze in place. Scrawled across the headstone were the words, "You forgot your promise." The letters were jagged, as if written with unsteady hands, and the sight of them made his blood run cold. Daniel fell to his knees, his breath visible in the frigid air. Memories of his grandmother flooded back. Her kind smile, her warm hugs, and the way she always reminded him to keep his promises. Tears stung his eyes as he whispered an apology into the silence. He spent the rest of the morning cleaning up the area surrounding her headstone and scrubbing off the words scrawled there. From that year forward, Daniel never missed a visit to her grave. Each New Year's Eve he brought flowers and sat by her headstone, speaking to her as if she was still there. But no matter how much time passed, he couldn't forget the figure outside his window, or the ghostly words she had spoken. And though he never saw her again, Daniel always felt the weight of her presence, as if she was watching, ensuring he kept his promise.
Second story.
In 1987, Victor received an unexpected invitation. It came in an elegant black envelope, the paper thick and embossed with gold lettering. The envelope itself seemed to carry an air of mystery, as if it had traveled through time to reach him. Victor's curiosity was piqued. He had never seen anything quite like it before. The message read, "You are cordially invited to a New Year's Eve celebration at Blackwood Manor. Festivities begin at 9 p.m. Dress to impress." Signed, from Mr. Blackwood. The invitation was both intriguing and unsettling. Who was Mr. Blackwood, and why had he chosen Victor? These questions swirled in Victor's mind as he examined the ornate script and the luxurious paper. As the night of the event approached, Victor couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. When he arrived, the mansion took his breath away. It was a towering estate, glowing warmly against the cold winter night. The manor stood like a beacon in the darkness, its windows aglow with a welcoming light that contrasted sharply with the icy landscape. Strings of lights illuminated the snow-dusted gardens, and faint music floated from within. Guests dressed in extravagant outfits milled about, their laughter echoing through the frosty air. The scene was almost surreal, like something out of a dream. The lights twinkled like stars, casting a magical glow over the entire estate. Victor couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder, mixed with an underlying tension he couldn't quite place. Inside, the opulence was almost overwhelming. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and fine champagne. The ballroom was a masterpiece of elegance, with gilded walls and marble floors that reflected the light in a dazzling display. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music strangely outdated but hauntingly beautiful. The melodies seemed to transport Victor to another time, adding to the surreal atmosphere of the evening. Victor grabbed a drink and tried to mingle, but something felt off. The atmosphere was charged with an energy that was both exhilarating and unsettling. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that every move he made was being scrutinized by unseen eyes. The drink in his hand felt like a lifeline, grounding him in the midst of the surreal experience. The guests' faces were familiar, yet he couldn't place where he'd seen them. Their smiles seemed too wide, their laughter too hollow. It was as if they were wearing masks, hiding their true selves behind a veneer of elegance and charm. Victor's unease grew with each passing moment, the sense of something being terribly wrong gnawing at him. The music, though enchanting, sounded decades out of place, as if it belonged to another era. The haunting melodies seemed to echo through the halls, creating an atmosphere that was both nostalgic and eerie. Victor felt like he had stepped into a different time, a world where the past and present intertwined in a delicate dance. At midnight, the enigmatic host, Mr. Blackwood, appeared at the top of the grand staircase. He was a tall, pale man with piercing eyes and a commanding presence. His arrival was met with a hush, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. All eyes turned to him, and Victor felt a chill run down his spine. At midnight, the enigmatic host, Mr. Blackwood, appeared at the top of the grand staircase. He was a tall, pale man with piercing eyes and a commanding presence. Raising a glass, he called for a toast. "To new beginnings," Blackwood said, his voice low and velvety. The guests raised their glasses in unison, their expressions a mix of reverence and fear. Victor couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a simple toast, that it carried a weight of significance he couldn't yet understand. Raising a glass, he called for a toast. "To new beginnings," Blackwood said, his voice low and velvety. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Victor felt a sense of foreboding, as if the toast marked the beginning of something he couldn't yet comprehend. The night was far from over, and Victor had a feeling that the true mystery of Blackwood Manor was only just beginning to unfold. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Victor felt a wave of dizziness. The room spun around him, and he struggled to keep his balance. The laughter and chatter of the partygoers seemed to grow louder, almost deafening, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. His vision blurred, and the music warped into a cacophony of distorted notes. He could no longer distinguish the melody from the noise. It was as if the very air around him had turned hostile, pressing against his eardrums and making it hard to think. Clutching his head, he stumbled outside to get fresh air. The cool night air hit his face like a splash of cold water, momentarily clearing his mind. He took deep breaths, trying to steady himself, but the sense of unease lingered. The moment he stepped into the cold night, the sounds of the party ceased. It was as if he had crossed an invisible barrier between two worlds. The silence was almost eerie, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just left behind. Victor turned back to the mansion and froze. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The grand estate, which had been filled with light and laughter just moments ago, now stood dark and foreboding. The grand estate he had just left was now dark and crumbling. The windows were shattered, and the vibrant gardens were overgrown with weeds. It was as if the place had been abandoned for decades, left to decay and be forgotten. Snow had piled up against the rusted front gates, and the air smelled of damp decay. The once majestic mansion now looked like a haunted relic from the past, a place where time had stood still. The next day he shared his story with an old local. The man's face turned grave. He listened intently, his eyes narrowing as Victor recounted the night's events. There was a heavy silence before the old man finally spoke. "Blackwood Manor burned down over 50 years ago," the old man said. "They say a New Year's Eve party ended in tragedy. No one survived." His words hung in the air, sending a chill down Victor's spine. It was a story that seemed too surreal to be true, yet the evidence was undeniable. Victor never spoke of that night again. But every December an invitation arrived at his door, always signed, "From Mr. Blackwood." The black envelopes were a grim reminder of that fateful night, and he couldn't bring himself to open them. He burned them without opening. Victor never attended another New Year's Eve party. The fear of reliving that night was too great, and he preferred the solitude of his own home as the year came to an end. But each year, as the clock struck midnight, he swore he could hear faint music and laughter echoing in the distance. It was as if the ghosts of Blackwood Manor were still celebrating, trapped in an eternal New Year's Eve party that would never end.
Final story.
Darren hated New Year's resolutions. He thought they were a waste of time, empty promises people made to feel better about themselves before slipping back into old habits. He made no secret of his disdain, and his friends teased him relentlessly about it every year. At the New Year's Eve party, fueled by cocktails and peer pressure, they dared him to write one. Rolling his eyes, Darren grabbed a napkin and scribbled, "I'll be a better person." With a dramatic flourish, he tossed the napkin onto the table, laughing as his friends cheered. It was a joke, an empty gesture to shut them up. When he woke the next morning, his head pounding and the events of the night blurry, Darren felt uneasy. It wasn't just the hangover, it was as if someone was watching him. He shrugged it off and went about his day. But strange things started happening. The first incident was at work. A co-worker accidentally spilled coffee on Darren's desk, and he snapped at her. As he stood fuming, his chair slid back suddenly, as if someone had yanked it. He froze, staring at the chair, but no one was near it. Later, while eating dinner at home, he ignored a call from his mother, muttering something cruel about her habit of nagging. The glass he was holding cracked in his hand, spilling water across the table. By the end of the week, Darren was jumpy and paranoid. He convinced himself it was all coincidence until he woke one night to find the napkin from the party sitting on his bedside table. He hadn't brought it home, he was sure of it, but there it was, the words, "Be a better person," glowing faintly in the dark. Terrified, he tried throwing it away, but it always reappeared, sometimes on his pillow, sometimes on his desk at work. The more he ignored it, the more intense the disturbances became. One night, after snapping at a waiter for messing up his order, Darren returned home to find all the lights in his apartment flickering. The napkin was there again, glowing brighter than ever. He picked it up, his hands trembling, and whispered, "I get it, I'll change." And he did. Over the next few weeks, Darren forced himself to be kinder. He apologized to his co-workers, tipped generously at restaurants, and even volunteered at a local shelter. The strange occurrences lessened, but the feeling of being watched never went away. As New Year's Eve approached again, Darren grew increasingly anxious. He decided to stay home, avoiding parties or anything that might trigger the mysterious force. At midnight, his phone buzzed. Heart pounding, he picked it up. The message was from an unknown number. Resolution complete. See you next year. The napkin vanished, but Darren had a feeling that it wasn't over. Whatever was watching him would return, demanding another resolution. He'd have to choose carefully as he wasn't sure he'd survive if he didn't.
New Year's Eve, a time to celebrate new beginnings, but for some, it's a night when the past reaches out to the present. Whether it's a knock at the window, an unkept promise, or an invitation to a party with guests who shouldn't be there. These stories remind us that the veil between worlds can be thin, and some things linger beyond the passage of time. So this year, when the clock strikes midnight, raise your glass carefully and be mindful of what or who might be listening. Sweet dreams and a happy new year.